The spoon slipped from President Traoré's hand as the first taste of cassava stew burned with unfamiliar bitterness. Not the flavor of improperly prepared food, but the unmistakable signature of betrayal. As the young leader of Burkina Faso locked eyes with his trusted head chef, both men knew that the real battle for the nation's soul had finally begun, not on dusty battlefields against foreign mercenaries, but in the shadows of the presidential palace itself. And the chef's light smile suggested that the poison already coursing through Traoré's veins was only the beginning. Before we dive in, if you're craving more jaw-dropping President Ibrahim Traoré stories, hit like and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. President Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the worn cap that shadowed his features as he moved through the bustling market of Ouagadougou. His simple cotton shirt and faded jeans were indistinguishable from those worn by countless other men navigating the narrow pathways between colorful stalls. For the third time this month, he had slipped away from the presidential palace, shedding the weight of his office to walk anonymously among his people. 2 kilos of rice and some cassava, please, he said to a vendor, deliberately roughening his voice. The woman barely glanced at him as she measured the staples, too busy calling out to other potential customers. These excursions were more than mere whims. They were his lifeline to reality, an antidote to the isolation of leadership. In the 14 months since he had risen to power in Burkina Faso, President Traoré had made difficult decisions that earned him powerful enemies, both domestic and foreign. He had renegotiated exploitative mining contracts, redirected military resources to protect vulnerable villages, and refused to serve as a puppet for former colonial interests. These policies make you a target. His security chief had warned just yesterday. There are those who preferred the old ways, when bribes flowed freely and resources left our country for pennies on the dollar. Traoré had dismissed the concerns with a wave. If I hide behind palace walls, afraid of my own people, then I have already failed as a leader. Now, as the afternoon heat pressed down on the market, he paused to buy a cup of cold bissap juice from an elderly vendor. The sweet tart hibiscus drink reminded him of his childhood, before politics and power had complicated his existence. President's men were here earlier, the juice seller remarked conversationally, unaware of his customer's identity. Asking questions about foreign visitors, checking papers. Something big must be happening. Traoré frowned. He had authorized no such action. The president's men, you're sure? Oh yes, official vehicles. Important-looking types. One was that minister always on television, Kaboré, I think. Defense Minister Kaboré had been at a conference in Nigeror, at least that's what he had reported to the cabinet 3 days ago. Unease prickled along Traoré's spine. Something wasn't right. As he continued through the market, his trained military senses heightened. He became aware of a small shadow following him. Pretending to examine a display of fabrics, he caught sight of his pursuer. A boy, perhaps 12 or 13, Rail, thin with intelligent eyes and clothes so tattered they barely deserved the name. Rather than confronting the child, Traoré moved toward a less crowded area. If the boy was a pickpocket, better to address the situation away from the bustle where anyone might overhear his presidential voice. He turned suddenly into a narrow passage between buildings and waited. Moments later, the boy appeared, startling when he found his target waiting. "Why are you following me?" Traoré asked directly. Instead of fleeing, the boy studied him with unnervingly direct eyes. "You're him, aren't you?" "The president." Traoré's hand moved instinctively toward the concealed pistol at his waist. "No one else notices," the boy continued quickly. "But I've seen you before, 3 times now. Always alone, always watching and listening." "And if I were the president," Traoré replied carefully, "why would you follow me?" "Because I need to warn you, they're planning to kill you tomorrow night." A child's fantasy, perhaps a trap. Yet something in the boy's earnest expression gave Traoré pause. "What's your name?" "Ismail. I live." He gestured vaguely toward the edges of the market. "Around." "And how would you know of plots against the president, Ismail?" The boy's face lit with unexpected pride. "Because of my radio." From his ragged trousers, he produced a battered but functional handheld radio scanner. "I found it in the trash behind the telecommunications building. Fixed it myself. It picks up all kinds of signals, police, military, even some private channels. Despite himself, Traoré was impressed. Such devices were expensive and usually restricted to security forces. That this homeless child had salvaged and repaired one spoke to remarkable ingenuity. "Last night," Ismail continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I heard them talking. They used code words, but I understood enough. They mentioned removing the obstacle at tomorrow's ceremony. They talked about the Patriot faction taking control. One voice, I think they called him Minister, said that once you were gone, they would restore profitable relationships with traditional partners." The details sent a chill through Traoré. The Independence Day military ceremony was indeed scheduled for tomorrow. And traditional partners had been exactly how his predecessor had referred to the foreign corporations that had plundered Burkina Faso's resources for decades. "Why tell me this? Why not go to the police?" Traoré asked, still cautious despite the ring of truth in the boy's words. Ismail gave him a look that suggested the president was being naive. "The police don't listen to street children, sir. They chase us away or worse. Besides," he hesitated. One of the voices mentioned Police Commissioner Ouedraogo as part of their plan. The commissioner was one of Traoré's recent appointments, a man he had trusted to reform the notoriously corrupt police force. If he was involved, "Do you have proof, a recording?" Pride again flashed across the boy's thin face. "Yes, sir. My radio can record." "Not much memory, but I saved what I could." He pulled out a small memory card from a hidden pocket sewn into his shirt. "It's all here." Traoré looked at the tiny plastic square potentially containing evidence of a coup plot being offered by a homeless child in a market alleyway. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on him. Yet his instincts told him this genuine. "Why help me, Ismail? What has the government ever done for you?" The boy's expression turned serious beyond his years. "Because you stopped the mining company from taking my village's land last year." "My family had a small farm there before." He swallowed hard. "Before the attack that killed them, I came to the city to find work. But," he gestured at himself, the explanation obvious, "you stood up for people like us. The others, they only care about themselves." Traoré felt the weight of the boy's trust, a burden heavier than any presidential responsibility. He made a decision. "I need to hear this recording, but not here. Will you come with me to meet someone I trust?" Fear flickered across Ismail's face. "To the palace? They'll never let me in." "Not the palace," Traoré assured him. "Somewhere safer." As dusk fell over Ouagadougou, President Traoré found himself in the unprecedented position of planning a counter-operation against his own senior officials, guided by a homeless child and supported by a bookseller. If he failed, history would likely remember him as yet another African leader who fell to a coup. If he succeeded, well, that would depend on how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated his government. "Why do they hate you so much?" Ismail asked suddenly as they waited for Sekou's return. "What did you do to them?" Traoré considered the question carefully. "I challenged a system that made them rich at the expense of our people. When I renegotiated the mining contracts to ensure fair compensation and environmental protections, many who received kickbacks lost their personal fortunes. When I redirected military spending to rural development, those who skimmed defense contracts lost their income streams." "So they want to kill you for money?" The boy seemed both disgusted and sadly unsurprised. "For money, for power, and because I refuse to be controlled by foreign interests who have considered our resources their entitlement for generations." Traoré's voice hardened. "They call it stability, when they can predict and manipulate a country's leader. They call it dangerous nationalism when we demand sovereignty over our own land." Ismail absorbed this with a thoughtful expression. "My father used to say that a tree that bears fruit will always attract those who would throw stones." The wisdom from this child's lips startled Traoré into a genuine smile. "Your father was a wise man." "He was a farmer," Ismail replied simply. "He understood that worthwhile things must be protected." Before Traoré could respond, Sekou returned with news. Colonel Ouattara had been contacted and was gathering his most trusted men, a small but elite force that would move without alerting the compromised chain of command. "We have 4 hours until the midnight meeting," Sekou reported. "Ouattara will rendezvous with us at the abandoned checkpoint 3 kilometers from the factory. As they prepared to move, Traoré noticed Ismail carefully repacking his precious radio. The sight of those small, capable hands treating the battered device with such care reminded him of his own childhood fascination with mechanical things before duty had called him to military service and eventually to leadership. "Whatever happens tonight," Traoré told the boy, "you have my word that you will never sleep on the streets again." Ismail looked up, his expression guarded, clearly accustomed to broken promises from adults in authority.
"I don't need charity, Mr. President.
Just justice for those who would betray Burkina Faso." Traoré regarded the child with newfound respect. "Not charity, Ismail. You've earned a place wherever you might choose it to be." As night fell completely, they slipped out through the bookshop's back entrance and into the uncertain darkness, guided by a child who had emerged from society's shadows to become an unexpected guardian of his nation's future. The abandoned rubber factory loomed in the moonlight, its skeletal frame casting long shadows across the weed-choked yard. President Traoré, dressed now in the combat uniform of Colonel Ouattara's Special Forces, studied the building through night vision binoculars. Beside him, Ismail pointed out details that only someone intimately familiar with the structure would know. "The main meeting will be there," the boy whispered, indicating the former administrative section. "It's the only part with a roof still fully intact. The second floor has collapsed in the east wing. But there's a maintenance passage that runs above the main office. You can hear everything from there." Colonel Ouattara, a compact man with the focused intensity of a lifelong soldier, nodded approvingly at the intelligence. "The boy knows his terrain. We'll position listening teams as he suggests." 18 Special Forces operators had assembled for the mission handpicked by Ouattara for both loyalty and discretion. They were men who had served with Traoré during his military career before politics had claimed him. Men who remembered him as a fellow soldier rather than a distant authority figure. "Our priority is confirmation and evidence gathering," Traoré instructed. "We need irrefutable proof of the conspiracy to present to the people. No engagement unless absolutely necessary." "And if they detect our presence?" Ouattara asked. "Then we adapt," Traoré replied, the soldier in him resurfacing with practiced ease. "But remember, these are Burkina officers misguided and corrupt, but still our countrymen. Lethal force only as a last resort." As the Special Forces team made final preparations, Traoré turned to Ismail, who was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Your part is done now," the president said firmly. "You'll remain here with Commander Coup at the perimeter observation post." Ismail started to protest, but Coup placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "The president is right. You've guided us to the target now. Let trained soldiers handle the rest." Reluctantly, Ismail nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the factory with obvious concern. The infiltration proceeded with precision. Using the approach routes Ismail had identified, the Special Forces team entered the factory complex undetected. Traoré, despite his position, insisted on joining the primary listening post team. If his senior officials were plotting his assassination, he wanted to hear the treason from their own lips. Through the maintenance passage, exactly where Ismail had indicated, Traoré and 2 operators crawled into position above the main office. Below them, through gaps in the deteriorating ceiling, they could see and hear clearly as vehicles began to arrive. Defense Minister Kaboré entered first, followed by General Diallo, Police Commissioner Ouedraogo, and 3 civilians whom Traoré recognized with a jolt of anger. Representatives from foreign mining corporations that had fought bitterly against his resource nationalism policies. "Gentlemen," Kaboré began once they had assembled around a makeshift table illuminated by portable lamps. "Tomorrow, Burkina Faso begins a new chapter. Our international partners have confirmed their support for the transitional government once Traoré is removed." "And the military units?" asked one of the corporate representatives, a Frenchman whose company had lost exclusive access to valuable manganese deposits under Traoré's renegotiated contracts. 70% of senior officers are with us," General Diallo reported. "The rest will fall in line once the deed is done or be replaced. The rank and file follow orders. They won't question the narrative that Traoré was killed by foreign-backed terrorists." Traoré felt cold fury building as he listened to the casual discussion of his planned assassination and the dismantling of the reforms he had fought to implement. These men had sworn oaths to Burkina Faso, yet were selling its sovereignty for personal gain. What about aftermath control? Police Commissioner Ouedraogo asked. There will be protests when the mining agreements are reversed and the land reclamations are canceled. That's why we need your forces deployed in key neighborhoods, Kabore replied smoothly. Particularly those areas where Traoré enjoys popular support. Any resistance will be firmly discouraged. The Frenchman nodded approvingly. My principals are prepared to provide additional security funding once the new arrangements are formalized. They understand that stability requires investment. Their discussion continued, detailing conspirators in various government ministries, military units that would secure strategic locations, and how the official story of Traoré's death would be presented to the public and international community. With each revelation, the president's determination hardened. The plot was more extensive than he'd imagined, reaching into multiple levels of his administration. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the factory. Through his earpiece, Traoré heard urgent whispers from the perimeter team. Unknown vehicles approaching multiple hostiles disembarking. The conspirators below heard it too. General Diallo drew his sidearm. Were you followed? He demanded of Kabore. Impossible, the defense minister insisted, though uncertainty flickered across his face. I took every precaution. Commissioner Ouedraogo was already on his secure phone. Dispatch security teams to the Eastern Industrial Zone immediately. Potential security breach at the meeting site. In the listening post, Traoré made a rapid decision. Colonel, initiate containment now. We can't let them escape or destroy evidence. Ouattara's acknowledgement was immediate. Outside, his special forces teams began executing their contingency plan, moving to secure exits and apprehend any fleeing conspirators. Below, chaos erupted as armed Menat, Ouattara's forces burst into the factory. It's an ambush, shouted General Diallo, overturning the table for cover as gunfire erupted. Through his earpiece, Traoré heard a frantic report. Sir, these are Presidential Guard units loyal to General Diallo. They must have been stationed nearby as security for the conspirators. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had been planned as a surveillance operation was devolving into an armed confrontation between the Special Forces and Presidential Guard units' Burkina soldiers, fighting Burkina soldiers, exactly what Traoré had hoped to avoid. As he prepared to withdraw from the increasingly dangerous listening post, a small voice came through his earpiece, a voice that should not have been on the tactical frequency. Mr. President, there's another way out. The drainage tunnel under the north wall. Ismail, Traoré demanded, recognizing the boy's voice with disbelief. How are you on this channel? I borrowed a radio, came the hurried reply. The bad men are calling for reinforcements. You need to get out now. Before Traoré could respond, the ceiling beneath them groaned ominously. Decades of neglect had weakened the structure, and the sudden movement and gunfire below had compromised what little integrity remained. With a splintering crack, the section gave way. Traoré and one operator managed to scramble back, but the second soldier tumbled through the collapsing ceiling, landing heavily amid the startled conspirators below. Cover blown, options limited, Traoré made the only decision possible. All units, execute Plan Delta, secure primary targets, and exfiltrate immediately. The factory erupted into coordinated action as Ouattara's forces moved with practiced efficiency despite being outnumbered by the Presidential Guard units. Their objective now was simple. Secure the president and the evidence of conspiracy. Then withdraw. Traoré himself rappelled down into the chaos, landing beside the injured operator who had fallen through the ceiling. Automatic weapon at the ready, he found himself face to face with Defense Minister Kabore, who stared in stunned disbelief. You're supposed to be at the palace, Kabore stammered, his composure shattered by the sight of the very man whose murder he had been planning. Disappointing you seems to be becoming a habit, Minister, Traoré replied coldly, securing the man's wrists with tactical restraints. General Diallo, seeing his conspiracy unraveling, made a desperate attempt to reach an exit, only to find his path blocked by Colonel Ouattara personally. Not another step, General, Ouattara ordered, his weapon trained unwaveringly at his superior officer's chest. Stand down, Colonel, Diallo commanded. That's an order from your superior. Units arrived, loyal to General Diallo rather than to the office of the presidency itself. Traoré and his team, with 3 captured conspirators in tow, found themselves increasingly surrounded. "The North Drainage Tunnel," Traoré instructed, remembering Ismail's suggestion. "Does anyone know where it is?" No one did. The factory blueprints they had studied hadn't shown any drainage system. Their exfiltration route was cut off, and ammunition was running low after the unexpected firefight. It was then that Traoré spotted a small figure darting between machinery at the factory's edge. Despite the bullets flying and the tactical situation deteriorating, Ismail had somehow made his way into the building. "This way!" the boy shouted, waving frantically before disappearing behind a rusted piece of equipment. "Follow the boy," Traoré ordered, making a split-second decision to trust Ismail once again. Behind a massive dyeing vat that had been abandoned when the factory closed, they found what appeared to be a solid wall. Ismail pressed against a specific panel, which gave way to reveal a narrow maintenance corridor. "It leads to the drainage system," Ismail explained breathlessly. "The factory used it to dispose of chemical waste. It comes out near the river, a kilometer away." Without hesitation, Traoré ordered his men into the passage. The captured conspirators pushed ahead of them. As gunfire intensified behind them, Ismail led the way through the dark, narrow tunnel, occasionally illuminated by the tactical lights mounted on the soldiers' weapons. "How did you know about this?" Traoré asked as they sloshed through ankle-deep water. "I explore everywhere I stay," Ismail replied matter-of-factly. "Knowing all the exits keeps you alive on the streets." The tunnel eventually opened into a concrete outflow channel and finally to the open air near the sluggish Cadiogo River. There, waiting in concealed positions, were the remaining Special Forces operators who had maintained the outer perimeter. With their position secure and reinforcements from loyal military units on the way, Traoré took a moment to assess their situation. The evidence of conspiracy was undeniable. 3 senior officials captured red-handed, planning documentation seized, and most critically, the foreign corporate representatives who proved external involvement in the coup attempt. Defense Minister Kabore, seeing the absolute failure of his plot, finally broke his sullen silence. "You don't understand what you've done, Traoré. The forces aligned against you won't stop because of this setback. There are interests that will never accept your resource nationalism, your defiance of established arrangements." "I understand perfectly well," Traoré replied. "I understand that you sold your country's future for personal enrichment. I understand that you were willing to murder your president because he interfered with your corruption." Kabore's expression twisted with bitter resentment. "You speak of corruption while calling yourself a revolutionary. What gives you the right to overturn decades of partnership with the West? Their investments built what little infrastructure we have." "Partnership?" Traoré's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call it when 90% of our mineral wealth leaves our shores while our people live in poverty? When foreign corporations pollute our water and displace our farmers with impunity?" Before Kabore could respond, Colonel Ouattara approached with urgent news. "Mr. President, loyal units have secured the palace and key government buildings. General Diallo escaped in the confusion, but we've issued alerts. The Presidential Guard units are standing downmost, weren't aware of the conspiracy, just following what they believed were legitimate orders." Traoré nodded grimly. "And our casualties?" 2 wounded, none critical. 2 of Diallo's men killed when they refused to surrender. The loss of life, even among those who had aligned themselves with traitors, weighed heavily on Traoré. Every Burkinabe death diminished the nation he had sworn to serve. As dawn broke over the horizon, Traoré found Ismail sitting alone by the riverbank, exhaustion finally catching up with the brave child. The president sat beside him in companionable silence for a moment. "You disobeyed a direct presidential order," Traoré finally said, though there was no anger in his voice.
"Remaining at the observation point was for your own safety."
Ismail looked up, his young face showing a maturity born of harsh experience. "With respect, Mr. President, no one survives on the streets by staying where it's safe. You needed help, so I helped." Traoré couldn't argue with that simple logic. "You saved more than just my life tonight, Ismail. You saved Burkina Faso from returning to the darkness of corruption and foreign control." The boy shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone would do." "No, Traoré corrected gently. What you did required exceptional courage and intelligence, qualities that should not be wasted sleeping rough and scavenging for survival. Later that day, after security had been reestablished and the nation informed of the foiled coup attempt, President Traoré made two significant announcements. First, the creation of a new security unit called the People's Guard, comprised of specially vetted personnel who would answer directly to the presidency, their primary mission being to safeguard Burkina Faso's constitutional order rather than any individual. The second announcement was the establishment of the Presidential Merit Scholarship Program, designed to identify talented young Burkinabe from disadvantaged backgrounds and provide them with educational opportunities previously reserved for the elite. The first recipient, he declared, was a young man whose quick thinking and extraordinary courage had saved the nation from catastrophe. Ismail, seated in the audience, wearing new clothes that still seemed to make him uncomfortable, looked down in embarrassment as applause filled the hall. But there was pride there, too, not just in himself, but in the country that was finally recognizing the potential of all its children, not merely those born to privilege. In the months that followed, the conspirators faced public trials that exposed the extensive network of corruption and foreign interference that had plagued Burkina Faso for generations. The evidence gathered that night led to the recovery of millions in stolen funds, the renegotiation of exploitative contracts, and a new era of transparency in government operations. General Diallo was eventually apprehended trying to cross into Côte d'Ivoire, his escape facilitated by foreign intelligence agencies unhappy with Traoré's independent stance. His testimony, given in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, implicated officials in several Western governments in the planning and funding of the coup attempt. As for Ismail, he thrived in his new environment. Though initially uncomfortable living in the modest but secure housing provided for scholarship recipients, his natural intelligence and thirst for knowledge soon made him a standout student. His particular aptitude for electronics and communications, first evidenced by his repaired radio scanner, blossomed under proper instruction. 1 year after the failed coup, President Traoré visited the technical academy where Ismail was studying. He found the boy now on the cusp of young manhood in the communications lab, surrounded by equipment far more sophisticated than his salvaged radio scanner. "They tell me you're at the top of your class," Traoré said by way of greeting. Ismail smiled shyly. "It's easier to learn when you're not hungry and constantly watching your back, Mr. President." Traoré nodded, understanding the simple truth in those words. "The new commander of the People's Guard has requested you for an internship next summer. It seems your talents are still in demand for national security." Pride flashed across Ismail's face before uncertainty replaced it. "Do you think I'm ready for such responsibility?" "You were ready when you followed a stranger through the market because you recognized your president needed help," Traoré replied. "You were ready when you risked everything to warn me of danger. You were born ready, Ismail. You just needed the opportunity to show it." As they walked through the academy grounds, students and instructors nodding respectfully as they passed, Traoré reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Had he not ventured out that day? Had Ismail not recognized him? Had the boy not possessed both the means and the courage to act on what he discovered? Burkina Faso might now be back in the hands of those who would exploit rather than serve its people. "A farmer understands that worthwhile things must be protected," Traoré said, echoing Ismail's words from that fateful night. "Your father would be proud of how well you've protected your country." Ismail smiled, the shadow of his past hardships still visible in his eyes, but now tempered by hope for the future, his future, and that of the nation that had finally recognized the potential of even its most overlooked children. "He would be proud of both of us, Mr. President," Ismail replied, "for remembering that a nation's greatest resource isn't what's in the ground, it's who walks upon it."